Hi everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Anna. Today I have a new story for you, called The Reluctant Pilot. It's about a stressed professional who discovers an unexpected way to face her deepest fear, and finds herself falling in love with something she once found genuinely terrifying. As always, just relax and listen, and let's begin. Claire Bennett was 34 years old, working long hours as a management consultant for a firm that sent her traveling constantly between cities. Her days blurred together in a rush of client meetings, airport lounges, and late-night flights home, the kind of schedule that left her permanently exhausted no matter how much she slept on weekends. She lived alone in a modern apartment near the city center, a place she rarely spent much time in, given how frequently her job required her to be somewhere else entirely. There was one enormous problem with a career built around constant travel. Claire was deeply, genuinely afraid of flying. It hadn't always been this way. As a child, she had actually enjoyed airplanes, pressing her face against the window during family holidays, fascinated by the clouds passing beneath the wing. Everything changed during a particularly rough flight when she was 19, returning from a university exchange program abroad. The plane hit severe turbulence somewhere over the ocean, dropping suddenly enough that drinks spilled and passengers screamed, an experience that lasted only a few terrifying minutes but left a lasting mark on Claire's nervous system for years afterward. Since that flight, every takeoff filled her with quiet dread, every small bump of turbulence sent her heart racing uncontrollably, and every trip through airport security came accompanied by a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had developed a private set of rituals to cope, gripping the armrest tightly during takeoff, counting silently to calm her breathing, avoiding looking out the window whenever possible. None of her colleagues knew about this fear. She had simply learned, over many years, to hide it well. Everything shifted during a weekend visit to her older brother Daniel's house, located in a small town a few hours outside the city. Daniel had recently earned his private pilot's license, a hobby he had pursued quietly for the past 2 years, and he enthusiastically insisted on showing Claire the small airfield where he kept his little 4-seat airplane during her visit. Claire had always known, vaguely, that Daniel was learning to fly, but she had never actually visited the airfield herself, preferring not to think too closely about small planes at all. Walking across the gravel parking lot toward the row of hangars, she felt her old anxiety stirring immediately, a familiar tightness settling into her chest. "You really don't have to come inside if you don't want to," Daniel said, noticing his sister's hesitant expression as they approached the hangar. "I know flying isn't exactly your favorite topic." "No, it's fine," Claire said, though her voice sounded less certain than she intended. "I want to see it. I'm just a little nervous, that's all." Inside the hangar, Daniel's small airplane sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, considerably smaller than Claire had imagined, its white body decorated with a simple blue stripe along the side. It looked almost fragile compared to the massive commercial jets Claire usually flew in, and somehow this made her feel even more nervous rather than less. "This is Bravo Charlie," Daniel said proudly, patting the wing affectionately. "Well, that's her registration, technically. Everyone at the airfield just calls her Bravo Charlie. I've had her for about 8 months now." The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the open hangar doors, illuminating small dust particles floating lazily in the air, the quiet countryside atmosphere feeling worlds away from Claire's usual hectic travel schedule between crowded international terminals, yet her attention remained fixed nervously on the small aircraft in front of her. "Would you like to sit inside, just for a minute?" Daniel asked gently, noticing his sister's obvious discomfort but not pushing too hard. "You don't have to. We can just look from here if you'd rather." Reluctantly, encouraged partly by curiosity and partly by not wanting to disappoint her brother, Claire climbed carefully into the passenger seat, her heart pounding rapidly the moment the small cabin door closed beside her. Daniel walked her patiently through the cockpit, pointing out the various instruments and controls with the calm confidence of someone who had spent countless hours studying every detail. "This one shows our altitude," Daniel explained, tapping a small round gauge. "This one shows our airspeed. And this," he said, pointing toward a compass-like instrument, "keeps us pointed in the right direction, even when we can't see the ground clearly." Despite her initial terror, Claire found herself unexpectedly curious, leaning in slightly closer to examine the array of dials and switches surrounding her. "It's a lot more complicated than I expected," she admitted quietly, surprised by her own reaction. "Most people say that at first," Daniel said, smiling knowingly. "But honestly, once you understand what everything actually does, flying stops feeling like some mysterious, terrifying thing happening around you. It starts feeling like something you're actually part of, something you can understand and even control." That weekend planted an unexpected seed in Claire's mind, though she certainly didn't recognize it as such at the time. Driving back to the city that Sunday evening, she found herself unable to stop thinking about the small cockpit, about Daniel's calm explanations, about the strange, unfamiliar curiosity that had briefly overtaken her fear during those few minutes sitting inside the aircraft. Over the following weeks, this curiosity gradually developed into something more serious. Late one evening, unable to sleep properly before an upcoming business flight, Claire found herself searching online for information about fear of flying, eventually discovering an entire community of people who had faced similar struggles. Many described therapy programs specifically designed for anxious flyers, courses that combined psychological techniques with basic aviation knowledge, teaching participants to understand exactly what was happening mechanically during moments of turbulence or unusual aircraft movements. She spent several evenings reading through forums where people shared their own stories, discovering she wasn't nearly as alone in this particular struggle as she had always assumed. Many described how simply understanding the physics and mechanics behind flight had gradually reduced their anxiety, transforming an experience once filled with helpless dread into something considerably more manageable. One particular post, written by someone who had struggled with flight anxiety for over a decade, described the turning point as finally understanding that the plane wasn't fighting against the sky, but actually working perfectly within it, a phrase that stayed with Claire for days afterward, capturing something she hadn't quite been able to articulate herself. She also discovered something she hadn't expected. Several fear of flying courses actually included an optional introductory flying lesson in a small aircraft, similar to Daniel's, designed specifically to help participants confront their anxiety directly rather than simply avoiding it. The idea terrified her almost as much as it intrigued her. Despite her growing interest, Claire still felt considerable hesitation about actually committing to anything. Her fear of flying, though slightly softened by her afternoon in Daniel's hangar, hadn't disappeared in any meaningful way. She mentioned her interest hesitantly to a few close colleagues during a work trip, most of whom reacted with a mixture of confusion and genuine surprise. "Wait, you want to learn to fly a plane yourself?" her colleague Marcus asked incredulously during a layover in the airport lounge. "You get nervous just boarding a commercial flight. Isn't a tiny plane even scarier?" "Apparently it's actually the opposite for a lot of people," Claire explained, though she still felt slightly uncertain herself. Understanding exactly what's happening, rather than just sitting helplessly in the back of a huge plane you don't understand at all, is supposed to help enormously. Despite the skepticism from colleagues, Claire eventually decided to enroll in an introductory course specifically designed for anxious flyers, held at a small aviation school not far from the same regional airfield where Daniel kept his aircraft. The course was led by an experienced flight instructor named Robert, a former commercial airline pilot who had spent the last several years specializing in helping nervous students overcome their fear of flying. Robert's calm, methodical teaching style immediately put Claire somewhat at ease during their very first meeting. He began the course discussing the basic physics of flight in accessible, engaging detail, explaining precisely how wings generate lift, how engines produce thrust, and, most importantly for Claire, exactly why turbulence occurred and why it posed essentially no danger to a properly functioning aircraft. "Fear usually comes from uncertainty," Robert told the small group of nervous students during their first session, echoing almost exactly what Daniel had once told her in his hangar. "Turbulence feels frightening because it feels unpredictable and uncontrolled. But mechanically speaking, it's simply air moving in different directions, something aircraft are specifically engineered to handle safely, every single time." During the second week of the course, wearing a borrowed aviation headset and sitting alongside Robert in the school's own small training aircraft, Claire found herself preparing for her very first flight lesson, something she genuinely hadn't imagined herself doing just a few months earlier. Her hands trembled slightly as Robert guided her through the pre-flight checklist, but remarkably, she managed to complete each step without panicking completely. "You're doing wonderfully," Robert told her afterward, genuinely encouraging. Most students struggle considerably more during their first actual flight lesson. Over the following weeks of the course, Robert guided the small group through a comprehensive curriculum covering the essential foundations of understanding flight from a pilot's perspective rather than a passenger's. One session focused entirely on how pilots communicate with air traffic control, teaching Claire and her classmates how to properly interpret the seemingly chaotic radio chatter that had always sounded so alarming to her as an anxious passenger. Another session covered weather patterns in detail, explaining how pilots carefully studied conditions before every single flight, identifying and actively avoiding genuinely dangerous weather systems long before takeoff. Claire found herself particularly fascinated by a session dedicated entirely to how modern aircraft systems worked, learning about the multiple redundant systems built into even small planes, understanding now how various backup mechanisms existed precisely to handle any single component failure without endangering the aircraft or its passengers. "It's basically layers upon layers of safety," Robert explained during that particular session. "Nothing depends on just one single thing working perfectly." Remarkable, honestly, once you really think about how thoroughly this has all been engineered. Encouraged by this small but significant success, Claire decided to enroll fully in Robert's 10-week beginner flying course, meeting weekly to learn basic flight controls, essential safety procedures, and the fundamental principles of piloting a small aircraft. She also began seriously considering, for the first time, whether she might actually want to pursue a full private pilot's license eventually, rather than simply completing the introductory fear of flying program she had originally signed up for. By the fourth week of her course, having gained considerably more confidence and practical knowledge than she ever expected to gain, Claire decided to fully commit, officially enrolling in the complete private pilot training program, a decision that surprised absolutely everyone in her life, including herself. The day of her first full flight lesson without the fear of flying training wheels, so to speak, felt simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Claire had spent the entire previous evening reviewing her study notes repeatedly, unable to sleep properly, checking the weather forecast obsessively to ensure conditions would be calm and mild for the lesson ahead. Robert, patient and encouraging as always, met her early that morning at the small airfield, guiding her through every careful step of the pre-flight inspection process. The small aircraft sat quietly on the tarmac that morning, its propeller motionless, a stillness that somehow made Claire's stomach tighten just as much as any turbulent commercial flight ever had. When Robert finally climbed into the seat beside her, calm and reassuring as always, Claire felt her anxiety settle somewhat, grateful for his steady presence throughout the unfamiliar process ahead. "Remember, smooth, gentle movements on the controls," Robert reminded her repeatedly as they taxied toward the runway. "The aircraft responds to exactly what you give it. If you stay calm and deliberate, the plane will fly calmly and predictably too." Despite Robert's calming presence, Claire's hand still shook considerably as she pushed the throttle forward for takeoff, though she managed to keep the aircraft climbing steadily under his careful guidance. When they finally leveled off at a comfortable altitude, the patchwork countryside spreading out beautifully beneath them, Claire felt an overwhelming mixture of pride and lingering nervousness completely unlike anything she had ever experienced as a passenger. "Congratulations," Robert said warmly, once they had safely landed back at the airfield an hour later. "That was an excellent first proper lesson." The following weeks brought a steep learning curve for Claire. She visited the airfield several times each week after work, initially feeling nervous before every single lesson, gradually developing genuine comfort and confidence in the cockpit. She kept a detailed logbook, following standard aviation practice, recording her flight hours, the maneuvers she had practiced, and any concerns that arose along the way. During her 6th week of training, Claire experienced her first genuine crisis in the air. Practicing a routine maneuver at a safe altitude with Robert beside her, the aircraft suddenly hit an unexpected pocket of turbulence, dropping and shaking noticeably more than anything Claire had experienced during previous lessons. Her old panic surged instantly, her hands gripping the controls far too tightly, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "You're okay," Robert said calmly, his voice steady despite the aircraft's continued shaking. "This is completely normal turbulence, nothing more. Loosen your grip slightly, and just keep flying the plane exactly as you've been trained to." Reassured gradually by Robert's calm explanation, though still visibly shaken by the experience, Claire forced herself to loosen her hands and continue flying smoothly, exactly as instructed. Within a minute, they passed through the turbulent air completely, the aircraft settling back into smooth, steady flight. "You handled that really well, considering everything," Robert told her afterward, genuinely impressed. Most fear of flying students would have wanted to land immediately after something like that. "You kept flying." "I definitely wanted to land immediately," Claire admitted, laughing somewhat shakily. "But something in my head just kept saying, keep flying the plane, exactly like you told us." This experience, frightening as it was, taught Claire an important lesson about the difference between feeling afraid and actually being in danger. She learned, firsthand and unforgettably, that her aircraft was fully capable of handling turbulence safely, regardless of how alarming it felt inside the cabin. As the weeks progressed into months, Claire's confidence grew steadily alongside her flying skills, which themselves improved remarkably, each lesson building naturally upon skills mastered during the last. She began practicing takeoffs and landings repeatedly, gradually developing the smooth, confident touch that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. However, during a routine lesson in early autumn, Claire encountered a different kind of challenge entirely. Practicing landings on a particularly windy afternoon, she found herself struggling considerably with crosswind conditions, something Robert's course had briefly covered but Claire hadn't expected to actually encounter so early in her training. Her first attempted landing drifted noticeably sideways, forcing Robert to gently take partial control to correct their approach at the last moment. "That's a tricky skill, even for experienced pilots," Robert reassured her afterward, noticing her obvious disappointment. "Crosswind landings take considerable practice. Don't be discouraged. Let's try again, and I'll walk you through the technique more carefully this time." Robert guided Claire through the specific technique required for crosswind landings over the following lessons, teaching her how to properly angle the aircraft into the wind during approach, then straighten it precisely at the last moment before touchdown. The entire process required considerable patience and precise attention to detail, quite different from the excitement of her earlier lessons, but Claire approached the challenge methodically, determined not to let this particular skill defeat her confidence entirely. Within a few weeks, following consistent practice, Claire successfully completed several crosswind landings entirely on her own, feeling a genuine surge of relief and pride handling this particular challenge that had once seemed so discouraging. "You handled that exactly right," eventually, Robert told her, genuinely pleased. "That's honestly one of the most important skills in flying, staying calm through frustration and continuing to practice difficult techniques rather than avoiding them." She began noticing subtle changes in herself beyond simply gaining new flying skills. Her anxiety during commercial flights for work, previously a constant, exhausting presence, seemed to decrease considerably. She found herself understanding the various sounds and sensations of commercial aircraft far better than before, recognizing normal engine adjustments and typical turbulence patterns rather than assuming every unfamiliar noise signaled some impending disaster. "You seem different lately, calmer during our trips," her colleague Priya observed during a business flight together in late autumn. "You used to grip the armrest the entire flight. What changed?" "Flying lessons, actually," Claire admitted, laughing slightly at how strange this explanation still sounded, even to herself. "I've been learning to fly small planes myself." Priya, initially skeptical like most of Claire's colleagues, eventually asked to hear more details during their long flight together, genuinely curious after noticing Claire's positive transformation throughout their business trip. Listening attentively as Claire calmly explained the physics behind their current flight's gentle turbulence, Priya noticed a stark contrast to the nervous, anxious colleague she remembered from previous business trips together. "This is honestly amazing," Priya admitted afterward. "I never would have guessed you'd become this comfortable talking about flying, let alone actually doing it yourself." Around the 10-month mark of her training, Claire faced her most significant challenge yet, her first solo flight, a milestone every pilot student eventually faces, flying the aircraft completely alone for the very first time, without Robert or any other instructor beside her. The morning of her scheduled solo flight, Claire woke up hours before her alarm, her stomach twisted with a familiar mixture of excitement and genuine terror. Arriving at the airfield that morning, Robert walked her through several practice circuits together first, confirming she was fully prepared before finally stepping out of the aircraft on the tarmac, leaving Claire alone in the cockpit for the very first time. "You're ready for this," Robert said simply, standing beside the aircraft door. "I wouldn't let you do this if you weren't." 3 circuits around the airfield, exactly as we've practiced together dozens of times already. "I'll be right here watching the whole time." The sight of the empty seat beside her, usually occupied by Robert's calm, reassuring presence, stopped Claire completely for a moment, a wave of pure panic threatening to overwhelm her entirely. A few other students and instructors around the airfield had already noticed the solo flight preparations, several offering encouraging waves from a distance. Panic gripped her briefly, remembering every possible thing that could go wrong without an instructor beside her to help. She took several deep breaths, remembering Robert's calm voice from countless previous lessons. "You know how to fly this plane," she told herself firmly, echoing words Robert had told her many times throughout her training. "You've done this exact circuit dozens of times already. Just fly the plane, exactly like you've been trained to." Taxiing toward the runway alone for the first time, radioing air traffic control with only her own voice rather than Robert's calm guidance beside her, Claire felt genuinely terrified. But as she pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft lifting smoothly into the air, something shifted inside her completely. The controls responded exactly as they always had. The instruments showed exactly what she expected. She was, remarkably, actually flying the plane entirely by herself. Completing her 3 practice circuits with careful, deliberate precision, Claire brought the aircraft in for landing, her hands considerably steadier than she expected them to be. The wheels touched down smoothly, exactly as Robert had taught her, and she taxied back toward where Robert stood watching, a wide smile visible even from a distance. "You did it," Robert said, genuinely thrilled, as Claire climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs. "Congratulations, officially, you're now a solo pilot." "I actually did this," Claire said, staring back at the small aircraft she had just flown entirely alone. From being terrified of every single flight to this. She immediately called Daniel, excitedly describing the entire experience, remembering gratefully how her brother's small hangar visit months earlier had unknowingly started this entire unexpected journey. "I told you flying could change things for you," Daniel said, laughing warmly over the phone. "Once you actually understand it properly, it becomes something completely different from what you imagined." Claire also visited her parents the following weekend, curious how they would react given her well-known fear of flying, a topic her mother still occasionally mentioned during family gatherings, usually while asking anxiously about Claire's upcoming work trips. "You, flying a plane yourself?" "Voluntarily," her mother said, genuinely astonished, examining the photo of Claire standing proudly beside the small aircraft. "I never thought I'd see the day, considering how nervous you always seemed on regular flights." "I was absolutely terrified too, honestly, when I started," Claire admitted, smiling. "But it's completely different once you actually understand exactly what's happening and why." Her father, always more adventurous than her mother, asked detailed questions throughout dinner, genuinely fascinated by Claire's description of learning to fly and the solo flight milestone earlier that week. By the end of the visit, both parents had looked through her logbook with genuine curiosity, her mother even hesitantly agreeing to take a short flight with Claire sometime in the future, once Claire had completed her full license. Inspired by her successful solo flight, Claire decided to share her unexpected new passion more broadly, particularly with people who struggled with similar anxieties to the ones she had once carried herself. She reached out to Robert's flying school, proposing a small workshop specifically for anxious travelers, similar to the very program that had originally started her own journey. Robert enthusiastically supported the idea, and Claire helped organize a small evening event at the airfield, sharing her personal story alongside Robert's technical explanations for approximately 20 attendees, many of whom described struggles remarkably similar to her own long history of flight anxiety. Robert brought along diagrams explaining turbulence and basic aircraft mechanics, teaching tools designed to demystify the experience of flying for anxious passengers who had never previously understood the science behind it. Attendees asked detailed questions throughout the evening, several visibly relaxing as Claire and Robert explained, patiently and thoroughly, exactly why various frightening sensations during flight posed no actual danger whatsoever. "Why does the plane feel like it's dropping suddenly sometimes?" one nervous attendee named James asked during the session. "That's usually just an air pocket, essentially a small area of less dense air," Robert explained patiently. "The aircraft briefly adjusts to it, which feels dramatic inside the cabin, but it's a completely routine, harmless event from the aircraft's perspective." Watching a woman named Helen, roughly Claire's own mother's age, gradually relax throughout the session, eventually asking increasingly confident questions about her own upcoming international flight, reminded Claire vividly of her own transformative experience months earlier inside Daniel's small hangar. "Were you ever as scared as I am?" Helen asked Claire directly during the event, her voice filled with genuine hope rather than just curiosity. "I was terrified for over a decade," Claire admitted honestly. "Completely terrified, hiding it well from almost everyone around me. But once you understand what's actually happening, that fear usually transforms into something much more manageable, sometimes even into genuine fascination." By the event's conclusion, several attendees expressed genuine relief and gratitude, a few even mentioning they felt noticeably calmer already about upcoming flights, simply from understanding the basic mechanics behind common in-flight sensations they had always found frightening. Claire happily provided information about Robert's ongoing courses, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction having potentially helped others toward the same unexpected, transformative understanding she herself had gained. As winter arrived, bringing colder temperatures and occasional weather delays to her flight training schedule, Claire reflected on her remarkable first year pursuing her pilot's license. What began as a hesitant, fear-driven curiosity following a single hangar visit had transformed into a genuine passion occupying a meaningful, cherished portion of her otherwise hectic professional life. Her relationship with anxiety, previously such a constant companion throughout her career of frequent business travel, had noticeably shifted throughout the year. Her business flights, once sources of quiet dread, had become considerably more comfortable, her understanding of aviation providing consistent, reliable reassurance amid what used to feel like helpless uncertainty. Colleagues at work continued noticing her calmer demeanor during trips, several eventually asking her detailed questions about pursuing their own flying lessons, inspired by her unexpected transformation. The following spring, having successfully passed her required written examinations and accumulated sufficient flight hours, Claire scheduled her official practical flight test, the final step toward earning her full private pilot's license. The examiner, a stern but fair man named Frank, spent an entire morning evaluating her flying skills across a demanding range of maneuvers, from basic navigation to emergency procedures Claire had practiced extensively but never actually needed during real flights. Waiting nervously afterward while Frank reviewed his notes, Claire found herself remembering, almost involuntarily, that very first afternoon inside Daniel's hangar, terrified simply sitting in a stationary aircraft on the ground. The distance she had traveled since then felt genuinely remarkable. "Congratulations," Frank finally said, extending his hand with a rare, genuine smile. "You've passed. You're officially a licensed private pilot now." Claire felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, considerably more intense than she had expected for a moment she had spent an entire year working toward. She immediately called Robert, then Daniel, then finally her parents, sharing the news with each of them in turn, her voice shaking slightly with genuine, disbelieving joy. "I still can't quite believe it," Claire told Robert later that same evening, sitting together in the small airfield's modest clubhouse, celebrating quietly over coffee. "A year ago, I couldn't even watch takeoff without gripping the armrest until my knuckles turned white." "That's exactly why this means so much," Robert said warmly. "You didn't just learn to fly. You completely rebuilt your relationship with something that used to genuinely frighten you." That's considerably harder than simply learning a technical skill. With her license finally in hand, Claire began occasionally assisting Robert during his fear of flying workshops, sharing her personal journey with new, nervous participants who reminded her vividly of her own uncertain beginnings just over a year earlier. Standing before a new group of anxious attendees one evening that spring, Claire found herself genuinely enjoying the unexpected role of mentor, patiently answering the same nervous questions she herself had once asked, remembering clearly how much Robert's patient guidance had meant to her during those early uncertain months. Fear usually comes from uncertainty, she found herself telling nervous newcomers, echoing Robert's own words from her very first introductory session, now understanding their truth from genuine personal experience rather than simply repeating someone else's wisdom. She also began taking her parents up for short, gentle flights around the local countryside, something she once couldn't have imagined offering to anyone, let alone confidently piloting herself. Her mother, though still visibly nervous during their first flight together, gripped Claire's hand tightly during takeoff but gradually relaxed as the flight continued smoothly. "You're really good at this," her mother admitted afterward, genuinely impressed, as they walked back across the tarmac together. "I was worried the whole morning leading up to this, if I'm honest." "I understand completely," Claire said, smiling. "I used to feel exactly the same way, every single time I boarded any plane at all." Reflecting occasionally on her unexpected journey, Claire often thought back to that single, transformative weekend visiting Daniel's hangar, remembering clearly her initial terror simply sitting inside a stationary aircraft on the ground. She never could have imagined, during that fearful moment, that flying would eventually become such an unexpectedly meaningful, genuinely joyful presence within her otherwise hectic professional life. And that's the end of today's story, The Reluctant Pilot. I really love this story because it shows something meaningful. Sometimes the things that frighten us most initially hold unexpected gifts, if we're willing to approach them with curiosity and understanding instead of avoidance. Before you go, think about this: is there something that once frightened you, that later became something you genuinely valued or even loved, once you truly understood it? Thank you so much for listening today. This has been Anna, and this is the podcast. See you in the next episode. Take care, and keep practicing your English.